Welcome to The Political Animals, a show where two political philosophers, one a right-wing radical, the other a left-wing heretic, come together to discuss the social, political and cultural issues of our day. I'm Jonathan Cole, one of those philosophers. The other is Holly Lawford-Smith. Holly, how are you today?
I am well today, yes. I'm sorry, I just checked and that's true. Yep.
Just checked in with wherever you check in to
Kidneys, I
discern
think.
your wellness.
That's where
Had a
it's
quick look
located.
around. Yep. I'm well today.
Checked on the inside. I am coming to you today with inferior quality equipment, so I'm not apologizing for that. It's nearly Christmas and I didn't want to go to the office.
Well, it sounds good to me. I can't speak for any other viewer or listener, but...
Oh, you and I both know the YouTube comments will be full of complaints.
Well, they will be full of complaints, but it'll be about the content and or one or other of our performances rather than things like
True.
sound.
Well, could be anything. Who knows?
You do have a spectacular new background, though, which I'm sure viewers will appreciate. People listening to the podcast, again, will be like, get on with the show. We don't see it.
It's actually real, too. It's a real background, not a fake background. So
yeah.
It counts in its favor.
It does,
Unlike our fake Unimalb background the other day.
Yeah, sense of humor. Okay, enough banter, Holly.
Okay, let's get on with it. Cracking on with right-wing utopias.
Yeah. We've already blown our banter quota. Like, there's a very...
That's enough. It's more than enough. Got it.
Yeah. Okay, so in this episode, we're going to be discussing the far right that's the sort of general context, but we're going to look at a specific issue to do with the far right. And we got this idea from a new issue of the Journal of Political Ideologies, which has a special issue that's just come out exploring far-right utopias in practice. And it has 4 articles, which are really case studies of lived far-right utopias from around the world, which is one thing that makes this interesting. It's not just America and Europe, the usual suspects. Holly and I have both chosen one of those 4 articles to read. We haven't read any of the other articles, which means I don't know anything about the article or the group that Holly has looked at. I can't even remember the name, and Holly had to only learnt moments ago which one I looked at. So we're going to take a look at these specific groups as case studies, and then we'll use that as a springboard to a wider conversation about the far right utopias. So Holly, you're going to begin. What is the name of your group, and tell me about it?
Can I just add, because I'm not sure if it was completely clear from that introduction, the special issue, it's focused not just on far-right ideologies, but like communities that attempt to implement the ideologies into practice as like a form of life. Maybe you did say that, but just so that that is absolutely clear. So that each article, I take it, is trying to really describe like a bit what is the set of ideas, and then a bit how did it go trying to live according to them. And so that's quite an interesting like topic, I think, for a special issue, because you're not just getting a like, oh, you should be committed to this God in this way. You're also getting like, what's the disaster, or how well did that go when they tried, or like, and at least mine had the plot of a kind of like crime novel or something, where you're like, oh, this is all sounding very good, and then it's like, disaster, all the ways that it went wrong, and then they're so predictable that you just end up fed up. Anyway, I'm spoiling the plot. So
it's a movie you've seen before, in other words.
It's a movie I've seen a lot of times. And it'll be interesting to hear if yours was the same. But so mine was a community that the founder kind of originally started things off in Basel, Switzerland, but then the community itself was founded in Bloomington, Indiana, in the States. And it's pretty small. It's like, I think 15 to 20 people like living on the land. And then they had people from the surrounding university campus and city coming in as like frequent visitors and like practitioners of the faith. And then they had a wider global community with some sort of notable figures that would come in like much more infrequently. And then it was about 200 people at most if you take the widest group. Okay, and then what are its basic tenets? It had 5 like principles of I don't even know what to call it. Principles, let's just call it of the community. Like the author is calling it traditionalism with a capital T, but then they're quite careful that it's not traditionalism in any colloquial sense. So that's not that helpful. It's like a very technical usage. So the first principle is spirituality. And here's the way there was a little text that set out some guidelines for living, and the text said, no distractions, passions, worldly ambitions, the spiritual first of all, to live for the spiritual. And there's some more description in the paper about what that really means. They've got some idea about primordial human spirituality. So it's something like very ancient and connected maybe to like first, whatever you would call like the first wave humanity or whatever.
Maybe primitive religion.
Primitive, yeah, very quite closely tied to the land, and then some sort of like metaphysical something, but it's not very well specified exactly what that is. So spirituality first. Second
Can I
principle.
just ask a quick question, Holly?
Go ahead.
So do I gather then it's not actually connected to or hasn't emerged out of one of the contemporary religious traditions with which we're familiar, like a Christian denomination or Buddhism or Hinduism or anything
It's kind
like
of interesting because there's a lot about the guy who founded it, and they say that in his writing, the guy who founded it is influenced by another guy, and the other guy combines Marxism, Hinduism about the caste system, and then the people who start practicing it are actually Islamists, but they consider Islam to be a there was this complicated language of like an exoteric expression of the esoteric metaphysics. So it was like there's some idea about this primordial spirituality. It has some plausible enactment in some features of Islam. Okay, and so then there's like Sufi practitioners who are like somehow close enough to this thing that they count as like in the ideological tradition. And of course, then that sets up some conflict because some of the far right are anti-Islam, and so the author tries to a little bit explain that. So I found all that like very complicated and hard to follow. It's just
So it sounds like it's a kind of syncretistic new religious movement, something like that. It's kind of
I don't even know what that word means. Syncretistic.
well, it's like pulling elements from different religions that are usually considered very distinct and separate by their members. And I think religious scholars, and it's not my field, talk about new religious movements in that it sounds totally novel. It's like this is the actual foundation of whatever this thing is, and it sounds quite separate from any of the traditional religious organizations or movements.
It is separate, I think that's right, except that it also is pretending to be the old and original one. So there's this discussion of like, well, it's not conservative because conservatives look back, but then the way it clarifies that is it's traditionalist because it looks back way further.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, so it does actually look back. It's just that it's focused on like the emergence of Homo sapiens or something. It's at some time where the pre-scientific like connection to the universe and nature has much more like spirituality in it, I guess, because there's much more mystery. So it's a bit complicated whether it's like a new thing hodgepodged out of existing things or it really is it makes pretensions to being an old thing, but that might just be part of how it's a new thing. So I don't know.
That actually helps me understand the traditionalism term, because then it's making a claim to be the most
original, exactly,
original, primitive, and that's really interesting. Anyway.
Yes. Okay. No, I think that's good to talk more about that because the spirituality stuff is the most important and first stuff, and that will also be relevant to the spoiler. Okay. Second principle is aristocracy. So they hate democracy, and they want a spiritual elite, and so that manifests in this charismatic leader who was the sort of intellectual founding father of the community. And they say about that, nothing democratic. It is necessary to be correct in everything, no casualness tending towards vulgarity, no misplaced inappropriate familiarity, proper language without laxness from the point of view of allocution as well as of grammar. So, and
The
there's some
linguistic authoritarianism.
yes, and there's some testimony from pseudonymized people who had been in the community saying that like the way of speaking was very stilted and artificial
Wow.
as a way of trying to really live up to this idea of like not being casual, being formal, and respecting authority. Third principle is childlikeness, and that's also interesting. So the way that they make that sound a bit more plausible is that like you're supposed to be capable of delighting in small things and particular nature. So it's a kind of disposition to the world, maybe like appreciating small things and beauty. But again, I'm going to bring that up again in the spoiler part, because the childlikeness, children are often naked. It's going to be a question of exactly what childlikeness as a principle countenances. And sorry, there's 5 principles altogether. The fourth one is aestheticism, which I thought was interesting in connection to some of Scruton stuff, which maybe we can talk about another time. But they're really like interested in things being beautiful, and the way they seem to understand that is like in terms of sober color schemes. So they, again, some of the testimonials describe like the houses were always in grays and browns, and the women are wearing like natural color saris. So it's not like a beautiful color scheme aesthetics, but it's a specific aesthetics. They say that, again, this is in the guidance manual, sober beauty in the forms of colors surrounding us, colors that are natural, happy, calm, Berber, Japanese, Red Indian. And then the final principle is virtue, and the virtues that they list are effacement, generosity, and the absence of pettiness and pretension. Okay, any questions about the principles before I tell you the spoiler?
No, it's very surprising actually. That's nothing. I've just never encountered something like this that is placed on the far right, and I'm guessing that far right categorization. You've got a kind of authoritarianism, this aristocratic element, lots of discipline, which is one issue I hoped we might be able to talk about, because my group is big on what is described by the researcher as a militaristic discipline. And I just wondered, this seems to be associated with the far right and the extreme right. And I was trying to wonder if it really is a distinctively right-wing thing. And if so, why? This kind of penchant for discipline and kind of rigorous moral codes and ways of living. So that was really interesting.
Yeah.
But I gather, I don't know if this was spelled out, but my mind, when you talked about the colors, my mind went to Plato's Republic and this kind of ancient Greek idea that the type of music children are exposed to, like different melodies, have a different effect on the soul. And so that the aesthetic is kind of almost has this moral power. And so you've got to be really careful, like what poetry kids are exposed to, what kind of melodies they learn or listen to, because it can shape the soul. And I wondered whether this whole, the way, this control around the way you speak, comportment, we could call it, and colors, was this, underpinning this, was there some sense of like, this is supposed to mold virtuous people? Like what's its purpose as far as you can ascertain it?
There wasn't a lot of detail about that. And it didn't sound like this community guidance booklet or whatever had a lot of detail either. It was mostly that this guy's doing intellectual writings, so it's focused on the ideology, and there's just like very little detail as to exactly how to put that in practice. And so the author is really just pulling on this kind of booklet that there was. But he does say that the person who influenced the person who founded the movement, which is, I don't know how to pronounce it, maybe Juenon or something, Guenon with a flick over the E. But that person was very, had a closest follower and collaborator who was an art historian, and that person, Kumaraswamy, had a Platonic understanding of beauty. So it can be that the Platonic comes through Kumaraswamy to Juenon, however you say it, and to this Schuon. Again, I don't know how to pronounce anyone's name. And Schuon is the founding father, Schuon. Anyway, so
quickly,
it's possible.
Did this group have a name for themselves? Like how did they describe their community?
In the article, they're just referred to as the Bloomington community. So
Okay.
I don't think so. Yeah.
So I do have
Um,
one final question of substance before we
Wait,
get
can
on
I
to
add one
the toilet.
thing?
Yeah.
Because just when you were saying about trying to like that, you said it sounds like an unfamiliar version of the far right. I just
Mm,
wanted to pick that up. They do say that traditionalism, which of course will be the broader category of which this is one
mhm,
incarnation, that the traditionalist critique of modernity, it rejects democracy, equality, nation, and popular sovereignty. And so
mhm.
maybe that
Yeah.
helps to show a bit more why
Yeah.
it's far right in the terms of our current understanding, because it is like anti-democratic,
Yeah.
anti-equality.
That's interesting because that's exactly takes us down the path of where my question was going to be. But you also made me realize that, one thing that occurred to me reading mine, because I was wondering how these four, we were only going to deal with two, where the connection is that actually locates them under this umbrella term far right. And it occurred to me that one way you could do it is to go based on what they reject, which is to say
Yes.
the problem situation that animates or motivates the formation of the community. And my question was going to be, and you started to answer it, maybe you have, so I'll still ask it in case there's some more detail. But what's their view of the outside world in which the community is situated?
Um,
Like, do they
it's
have a view of
interesting.
America or the nation state or society or
I
contemporary
mean,
culture?
all I could glean, so of course, because they're anti-democracy, they're going to be anti the arrangement of the outside society. But this group in particular seemed to be quite like relaxed about, like they considered outsiders as profane,
Hmm.
but they were not insular. Lots
Hmm.
of the
Oh, okay.
students who would come regularly just lived
Uh,
their lives normally out in the Bloomington community and just came on like Tuesdays and Thursdays for prayer or whatever.
mhm.
And they didn't homeschool the children.
Oh,
Um,
really?
yeah,
That's
so
interesting.
it was not like, oh, the
It's not segregation.
heathens out there, not at all. And I thought that was really interesting too. It was like attractive enough to enough people that it was sort of able to be self-sustaining on a quite open and voluntaristic
Mm-hmm.
understanding. And there is something relative to that I want to come back to, but I think we'll do that much later once I've
Yeah,
heard
yeah,
more about your case.
yeah.
Can I
All
do
right,
the
talk
plot
about
twist now?
yeah, yeah. I want to hear about the spoiler.
Plot twist, of course, is just that as in every cult with a cult leader, it ends up all being a sex pest thing.
I know. What is it about?
It's
What
like a
is it about
story
that?
we've heard a million times before.
You mean to tell me the guy suddenly gets a revelation that he needs to sleep with everyone's wives or something like that? It seems to be
Yeah, so
the invariable
I know it's
culmination or
invariable.
climax of every cult.
Exactly. So the leader, the author says there's two main problems. One is just the charisma of the leader, so that everyone kind of wants to be close to him and that causes infighting and tension. And the other thing is that it turns out he has 4 wives, I think. So he had an official wife who was a virgin and actually ran the day-to-day community. But then he had these 2 other wives that he brought with him from Switzerland, I think. And then I think he took a 4th wife, like while in the community. And there's a bit of debate in the paper about whether that was like, because under Islamic law, he would have been allowed to have multiple wives, but in America, he wouldn't. And they chalk it up to adultery rather than polygyny.
Although
But
4 is the number you're allowed in Islam, so that I wonder
and
if
he
you
was
did model
still
that.
he was still in violation because apparently, and you'll know more about this, sorry, but you can correct me if this is wrong. Apparently, he was still in violation because the wives have to be public under Islam and they were a secret.
I don't know what the official teaching of Islam is, but I do know
Okay.
it's not uncommon for men in Muslim majority countries to take secret wives.
Oh,
They do
really?
get
Okay.
married by an imam, but they don't necessarily tell
Okay.
the public wife, number one.
Yeah, so the article was making it as though it was very clear that the Islamic faith requires, like, it permits multiple wives, but the wives have to know and the
That may be
public
the
has to
official
know.
teaching. I don't know. But there's always that gap between teaching and practice that you get in every religion. So
Yeah.
that could be right.
Um, Yeah, so I think basically the summary of that, like, okay, so then he's like having all these wives and it causes all the strife, and some people decide it's a sex scandal. There's also all this nudity related to the childlikeness, and his youngest wife is constantly dancing nude for everyone. Some people decide that's sexual abuse and leave the community, and other people say one should never question the prophet or whatever. So there's a sort of question of like how to interpret that stuff. So the author's conclusion is that the putting it into practice went very well when it came to the aesthetics. Hard to know, but it seemed to go okay when it came to the, well, now I'm forgetting what all the principles were. Tick on the aesthetics, tick on the aristocracy, sorry, because they had a real hierarchy and sense of deference. And then not so clear tick on the spirituality, given this idea about not being distracted by worldly passions, because they absolutely were constantly distracted by worldly passions, including sex. So yeah, I thought that was super interesting, actually.
You know what's really interesting, Holly, is I think if you described this group to me outside of the context of this special issue of the Journal of Ideologies, I would probably just label it in my mind as a cult and move on, because that just occurs to me. Okay, I hadn't thought of this before. This idea that a cult might also be a political ideology, such that it can be classified as really a far right cult, which is kind of interesting. I don't know if you have any perspective or comment on that, and I guess, like, in what sense is there a political dimension to that, such that we could call this a political ideology, or is it more like a far right cult that, just in terms of its ideas, seems to be over on the far right rather than somewhere on the left?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would have just assumed a cult has to have a pretty powerful and attractive ideology just in order to attract members, right? I mean, maybe there are some where it's really just a cult of personality about the charismatic leader. But yeah, then it just seemed to be like, well, now you have this attractive ideology, and if it's got a spiritual dimension, then it's a religion. If it's got a political program, like it's involved in parliamentary politics or it's trying to kind of advocate for change, then it's also got a political dimension. And the question is just like how exactly to classify it. And maybe I should say one more thing about why it's classified by the far right. Like, this paper has a like diagram of intellectual influence, and it has Julius Evola in the lineage. And I think part of the justification for, because then it's like almost derivative, like as though that's a clear far right thinker, and then anyone influenced by him and kind of carrying on some of those ideas then is just conceptualized as being in that far right group. And there's some mention of, is it pronounced Dugin, or again, I don't know how to say anyone. So Dugin's mentioned as being kind of in this Evola lineage as well. And
this
again,
is
that ultimately
Russian ideologue that's supposed to be influential.
Well, he's a philosopher, apparently. I'd like to read one of his books and see what all the fuss is about, but I haven't done so yet.
You know what, Ollie? He'd be a great subject matter for us to do at some point.
We should absolutely. Yeah, if you can get hold of the book.
I don't know anything about him.
The books are banned on Amazon, so it's apparently quite difficult to get your hands on any of his work. But I think there's PDFs online that like angry people have posted in his defense. So
yeah. You know, something that might be worth mentioning from the introduction that I picked up, just to be fair to the kind of scope of articles here, is that it does make a distinction between far-right parliamentary parties and far-right non-parliamentary parties, well, not really parties, but movements. And these articles are looking at those that shun parliamentary politics and are differentiated because of their utopianism and the fact that they're, like you said very nicely at the beginning, they're trying to live out their particular far-right ideology, not trying to implement it in the whole of society necessarily through the official institutions of power. So maybe that kind of obviates my question altogether. So where's this group now, Holly? Is it still around? Did it survive that crisis?
They did, yeah. So since the 80s and still around, but very little is known about the current and ongoing membership. And that was a reason the author gave to focus on this period where there was much more known and there were these sources and so on. So that's just kind of mentioned. But let's go to yours before we run out of time.
Yeah. So I looked at a group called the Heralds of the Gospel, which is an official religious order of the Catholic Church that emerged in Brazil in 1999.
Okay.
And there's some actually interesting, significant differences. So this is actually a huge group. They're in.
Mm.
It's been exported out of Brazil. They have a presence in 78 countries. They have a
Oh,
huge media empire. The English language YouTube channel alone has 134,000 subscribers. They claim that
oh,
their magazine has 1 million subscribers worldwide. They're in communion with Rome, so they're kind of officially incorporated into the Catholic Church. But these religious orders have a good deal of autonomy. They tend to be founded by charismatic leaders. In this case, a guy called, no, I'm going to butcher the name, just like you, João Claudius or something like that. And, you know, the religious orders generally start and then they get officially sanctioned by Rome at some point, but they kind of retain their own style. You know, they've got their own kind of dress or habit. So officially, they're supposed to be subject to the official doctrinal teaching of the church, but it's always this tension with them. And so they're pretty big. They've got hundreds and hundreds of priests. They've got their own seminary where they train priests. There's a female version, the Sisters of the Heralds of the Gospel. I think there's supposed to be 30,000 members in Brazil alone, but they do have an intentional community.
yeah, that's what
And
I wanted
they're
to ask. So,
massive on discipline. So it's kind of interesting. I found, I mean, I didn't know anything about this group before reading the article. And so there's a lot of questions I have that are unanswered. And interestingly, I could not find any information to elaborate on some of those questions. And it is a very secretive group, as these groups often are.
but do you know what the community, like in what sense, like they're living in the
Yeah.
same town, or what's the form that the community takes?
Yeah, I don't know if it's multiple communities in Brazil. Clearly, they've got the 78 countries, but there is at least
Right.
one main center outside of Sao Paulo where they have these incredibly opulent and ornate churches and college. Like they're spectacularly beautiful, depending on your aesthetic, but like they look like they're rolling in money, and they wear these like pristine outfits that are very, very distinctive, even within the context of Catholic religious orders. And they do love to parade and do all kinds of elaborate and really, really well drilled marches that remind me, actually, have you seen those North Korean military
Yes.
parades?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not quite at that extreme level, but it's not just simple marching. They go in circles and they have like really distinctive marches with hands and legs going here, there, and everywhere. But and just in terms of the sort of, just to tie into something you said about your group, they have this thing called an ordo, which is like their rule book, and it's very stringent. According to the author Georg, who wrote the article I'm looking at, it tells you how to brush your teeth. I saw a TikTok video about how to actually put your tunic and habit on. You know, you go on your knees and pray, then you start with the boots, and then you put this on. Allegedly, like when you sit at a table, there's got to be a certain distance between your torso and the
My
table.
brain's now full of how you're on your knees, but you're trying to put a boot on behind you on your foot.
No. Well, you start with the prayer, and then you like sit
You get
down,
up.
I gather, and you put on these.
No, I'm sure there's a better explanation. It
Yeah,
just
yeah.
was funny
In
in my
any
brain.
event, like a level of regulation of behavior that's pretty extreme by kind of Western liberal standards, even very extreme within most Christian denominations, and even the Catholic laity just aren't expected to live quite like this extreme rigor. And that's the distinctive practice of the group, the Heralds of the Gospel, as a religious order. And
Does
then
it
let me come
say
to,
anything about why the discipline is so important, or that's just a feature that's stated, but it doesn't?
it wasn't explicated in the article, but if I had to guess, just using my own background knowledge, I think it would be for spiritual development. There's a long tradition, particularly in Catholicism, of self-abnegation and extreme discipline as a way of developing your spirituality. You get this it's very common in monasticism, and it's very big in Orthodox monasticism. It's the asceticism of like fasting and sort of keeping the passions at bay. It lifts you to a higher kind of spiritual plain, and I think it does tie into the larger social vision, which, according to Wink, is what he calls an ideological desecularization project, in which they do want to wind back the decadent cultural degeneration that we're in, re-Christianize Brazil and presumably the rest of the world. And they are animated by a neo-integralist political theology, which is a kind of 21st century version of a 19th century Catholic political philosophy that really wants a Catholic confessional state, but not in the insipid way you get in places like Denmark and the UK. What they mean is, like at the most extreme end, people writing today will say, well, to be a citizen, you have to be baptized in the Catholic Church. The laws should reflect the kind of natural law doctrines of the church. So, abortion would be illegal, same-sex marriage would be illegal, and presumably the education system would be thoroughly religious, aka Catholic, not in the way that you get these Catholic schools in name in Australia where they go to chapel once a week, but they actually teach a secular curriculum that's determined by the state. So there is this kind of radical social vision, and so I think the idea is that, which is what you often get in these type of far-right religious Christian groups, which I know best, is you develop a vanguard of like spiritually pure, strong people who are the light on the hill that shows people the way. But there isn't really, as far as I can see, some kind of concrete political program beyond proselytizing the message through media and education. One of the interesting questions I had, and I don't know the answer to this, and this doesn't really pertain to your case study, is why this is so popular. Like, the numbers are significant here. And it was interesting seeing a TikTok video of the sisters of the Herald. They were all like early 20s. There's a large group of young women. It's multiracial, so it didn't really seem to have that nativist element of the far right, because on the English YouTube channel, at least two of the main priests were Indians.
Okay.
And that doesn't actually surprise me. And then in the Brazilian context, it has emerged out of that milieu of the right. There was some suggestion that Jair Bolsonaro, who I think many people might classify as a far-right president until I think it was last year, I think he attended a service, or he had some kind of connection that may have been personal or whatever. So they seem to be plugged into that milieu of the right, and I don't really know anything about the right in Brazil, so I can't comment. And then the utopian element was this notion of the kingdom of Mary, which I could find no information on YouTube, in academic journal articles, which apparently is part of this apocalyptic vision that you don't get in Protestantism, where there's supposed to be some reign of Mary before Christ returns and judges the world. But to be honest, looking at the English YouTube channel, there was no politics whatsoever. It was all missionary work. And you would even have videos, just to give you a sense. So I looked at a video, it was like 5 things a Catholic shouldn't have in their house. And then it'd be something on exorcism or fighting the devil or some self-help stuff. And so I was a little problematized about the extent to which this is far right and utopian. And that's not to say it doesn't have a lot of far right.
Because you think it's just
elements.
Catholic.
Well, it seems primarily a religious movement that may have a political theology. And the political theology, if it's neo-integralist, that is conservative, because they want to...
Wait, hold on. Why are you assuming that something can't be far right if it's religion?
Oh, it can be, but just in terms of the research I did outside of the paper, these guys were never talking about politics. Now, it's possible they have secret political connections that they're not public about.
Sorry,
Maybe
my community was not... I don't think that's in the presumptions of the special issue, actually. And we can argue about that if you like, but I did not read these papers as saying that something had to have a like parliamentary or like political within the current democracy program to count as far right.
Yeah.
That it's far right is being used in sort of like very, it's a way of carving up the conceptual space of ideologies, and something that's merely an experiment in living or a vision for a way of life whether it's explicitly political and inside our system or not would still count on this way of carving up the space. And I think my community, it was primarily spiritual, and they're anti-democratic and anti like a lot of what the current order is. They're just trying to do their own thing in the wilderness on some land. So I think I'm just questioning, maybe we need to use the same concept of far right, so that you're saying it's not far right because it's not political, and I'm saying it is far right because it's got like these weird traditionalist, authoritarian, whatever elements or something.
That's why I raised those two issues earlier, which I think I raised so that I could come back to. One is like the militaristic discipline. If that is a kind of feature of being far right, then these guys are thoroughly far right. But it wasn't clear exactly what the political significance of kind of a band marching round is beyond its kind of aesthetic or internal.
Or communitarian / collectivist rather than individualist. So it's again, and it's an expression of rejection of the current values.
But then that other, I did throw out that idea, and this is where our two movements intersect, in that there is a good degree of concentricity in what they reject. So this is an anti-modern kind of reaction, just like it sounds like your community was. So I think they would be critical or antithetical to the same kinds of things. So perhaps even egalitarianism. And if a citizen has to be a baptized Catholic, then every other citizen or every other person who's not baptized in the Catholic Church is by definition going to be some kind of second class citizen. And there's this controversy about the Jews, and this does conflict with the official doctrine of the Catholic Church post Vatican II, which we don't need to get into. But I also just want to emphasize that there are a couple of indications of connections to more explicitly far-right political parties and movements. And I'm just conscious that because it's quite secretive, we're looking at the public face of it. And maybe even the members don't know, but for all we know, the leadership, maybe they fund far right-wing politics. Maybe they're lobbying for policy in the background. That would not be uncommon for far-right Christian movement. So I'm not saying they're not far right. I mean, they're definitely not on the left. I was just kind of pondering where the boundaries of this term are, because it's a lot of their work just seems to be focused, like, to give you a good example, so they're in the exorcism business, and just, is exorcism a far right thing? It's not obviously political in any sense. It's extracting a demon from a person who you believe has been possessed. So a lot of their stuff is kind of purely religious, and it seems to be a lot of emphasis on that. And yes, the religious movement can also be political, but I wasn't getting the sense that the politics, at least in their public communication, was really that important. So maybe it's just hidden.
I think we're still not quite communicating, we're still not quite meeting up on the point. My point was like, I don't know if that's a helpful understanding of like the way that you're using the word political. I don't think that's a shared presumption with at least my author. That I don't think the idea is like only use the term far right if the movement is political in Jonathan's sense. I think that's not. I think their sense of far right is like exists in some tradition of intellectual heritage, or has certain concepts in it, or rejects certain presumptions of like And we're trying to work out exactly what, right? Because we don't have the triangulation between all the articles, and we haven't read everything in this journal. And it sounds like the whole journal's devoted to trying to figure out what the hell. But I'm just saying, I don't think that their presumption is that if it's not involved in current political parties, then it couldn't be the far right.
I totally get your point. So which is interesting because it means the far right could be a broader concept than a political concept.
Absolutely, and it could just be a religion. And so then the question is, what values have to be encoded in the religion such that we would put it on the right rather than the left in this new way of talking? And what would make us call it the far right rather than just the right? And then, maybe discipline as a candidate, and anti-equality is a candidate, and
Yeah.
anti-nation is a candidate, and we have
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
figure out what goes in. Yeah.
Yeah. The
Did you have a
yeah.
plot twist to report?
No, it just seems like they're going
They're going
gangbusters.
well. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's good.
I like they
That's
seem
good
to
that we
be
got a
that's outgrowing
success.
membership.
We've got a success story and a not so success story, so that's quite interesting as well.
Yeah, and that in that sense, it's a case study in something I don't really have an answer to, but I do think about, which is this seeming popularity or recrudescence of kind of right-wing populism,
Man, you're
and
using
particularly
so
amongst
many
young
words I
people.
don't know today, Jonathan.
Yeah,
So I need a
well, I
little
mean, just
thesaurus nearby.
well, certainly that there's
What
this
is a recrudescence?
recrudescence, like a reemergence,
Reemergence.
reflowering
Fancy.
of something like that. But if you look at, we've got the rise of Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. You've got Viktor Orban in Hungary, the election of Giorgia Meloni, Brexit. Marie Le Pen came closer than ever to winning the French election, and I think right-wing party or far-right parties. There's a kind of language issue here with
And
when
Trump
far-right
wouldn't count
becomes
as far
extremism.
right, surely.
Well, see, I wouldn't
You
put
can't
Trump
just roll the
personally.
whole right together and then be like, oh, the resurgence of the far right,
Yeah.
right? Like, no, the resurgence of the slightly center or right of center or whatever, that's not the same phenomenon.
No, I think
I'm wary because there's such a narrative at the moment, right? Of like the resurgence of the far, the pop, like, and it's like, oh,
I know. So, and I'm quite consciously using the word narrative here too, that because you look at even Viktor Orban and Giorgia Meloni, these cases always get they're less straightforward once you take a closer look.
details.
But there's certainly a narrative in the scholarly world and just the popular media that there's this rise of right-wing populism.
There is a narrative.
You see the titles of some articles, is the far right becoming getting mainstreamed and all this kind of issue. All I'm saying is, and this is one thing that occurred to me looking at what I would call the success of the Heralds of the Gospel, just in terms of membership and their footprint, global footprint, and their sort of density in Brazil, is why this. Let's just say this is far right. Why is the far right becoming so popular? What is the attraction for particularly young people today? And I don't know the answer to that, but it seems that's a question I
feel like we could take a good shot at the answers though, right? Like, it doesn't seem mysterious to me at all that like in this age of like oversaturated information and like permissive parenting and individualism and completely open future rather than having a lot of structure, like you're going to inherit your mum's business and go into that, like that young people could be searching for, or that things could look really attractive that were very structured, like religions, and something that has more of a sense of spirituality or meaning in it. Like, I don't know, I think that the critique of, I don't know if modernity is the right word, but whatever we've got now, there's plenty to critique about its values, and like the sense that a meaningful life is going to be buying stuff regularly and trying to get some bullshit job that you spend most of your time at, but is like nothing. And then that pushes your aspirations onto like romance, but that's constantly disappointing. And then you wonder, what is it all about even? So I can sort of really see how attractive these like resurgent, that would have been a time to use your new word, which I've already forgotten.
Recrudescence.
Recrudescent. Yeah, I can see how that's really attractive and offering some meaning and structure and community and all these things that it's really hard to come by these days. So I don't find it that mysterious, I don't think.
Yeah, so in that sense, we could say, or this is what I would say, is that it's an extreme solution to a problem most people can recognize. So, like, do I think they're wrong about cultural decadence and degeneration? No, I can get on board with that. But do I want to go and march around and worry about how to brush my teeth? That's
Put your hood on.
not my cup of tea. So
I'd do it for a week though, just for the experience. That could be interesting.
Yeah. So there is, and you could bring the far left in here too, because I think that's often also reacting to things that even people on the right could acknowledge are wrong with society, and so in a way they're just an extreme solution versus what other people take as a kind of more moderate
Yeah.
response to often agreed problems, I think. But then again, I guess we are then at a particular juncture in our civilizational history or development where we're going through a period of disenchantment,
Yeah.
disaffection, loss of faith, and just the breakdown of a kind of hegemonic worldview, I'd say. And so now Pandora's box is open, and there's lots of different choices, and there's the ability to experiment, because when that hegemonic worldview breaks down, lots of entrepreneurial
Yeah.
alternatives can
Which is
pop up.
kind of exciting, right? And I think that actually takes me to maybe one thing that I wanted to talk about that's really in the like big picture, maybe more relevant to like how the special issue was introduced, which we both read. There's a sense in the way it was set up that like these two case studies we've been talking about are like experiments in living. I don't think they use that phrase, and that phrase comes from the pragmatists as far as I know, but I think that would be the correct description. So there's these experiments in living that are enacting far-right ideologies in practice and kind of seeing how they go. And maybe it's like, oh, we found out your one went quite well and my one went quite disastrously. And that's interesting to know. And part of that is like, it's learning from history, because my author pointed out that like, yeah, communism seemed like a really appealing ideology, and so did fascism. But then they were tried out and turned out they were a lot less attractive as actual implementations. So that's all really useful. But the thing that I was really struggling with was like liberalism, like in what sense then is this post-liberal or non-liberal? Because within a liberal society, of course you have freedom of association. You can come together in communities, so long as it's voluntary, to do whatever you like, including buy a bit of land and live together in a commune, or practice a new religion, or you can do all that stuff. You would need to have, I guess, freedom of exit, and you would need it to be voluntary rather than like that you were just kind of indoctrinated into it from birth or whatever, or coerced in some way. But so then I was really just like trying to figure out, in what sense is this really an experiment in living, doing a kind of micro, I forgot the end of that word, whatever the end of that word will be, micro version of the macro thing that if you really got everyone on board, you might be able to try with a whole country or a whole continent or something. It just seemed like another way of describing it would be like, there's nothing utopian or experiments in living about this at all. It's just one of the very many conceptions of the good that are permitted under liberalism. And if your ideology is attractive enough, you will attract more voluntary adherents, and you can do whatever you like. So then it's not really post-liberal at all, is it? It's just normal stuff.
So what you could, one construal of this, which is really interesting actually, is you could see these ultra-conservative, far-right, intentional communities as expressions of liberalism. That is, they manifest the pluralism and freedom that's enabled in the liberal system.
100%.
And I suppose then the question becomes, so in my case with the heralds of the gospel, this neo-integralist political theology is prima facie illiberal. So if it were implemented, that would then be some kind of post-liberal
why is it illiberal
system. Well, you would have the Catholic Church would effectively become the state.
Oh, no, sorry, but you're saying it already is prima facie illiberal. Why?
Just in terms of its ideology.
Say what you mean.
So the neo-integralist view is that the state and the Catholic Church should integrate into one, and then everything from our education to our laws.
I see, but it isn't in its current instantiation. You're just saying, were it to become...
I'm saying that is according to Wink, their official ideology.
But they're not... Sorry, just so I understand correctly, I thought they are currently operating as a religion, and they have lots of adherents, but it's not that the state has adopted that religion.
No.
Yet, you're just saying they wanted to. So it's not currently not liberal. It just aspires to be.
Yeah. So
right? Okay.
if you just look at the official ideology, as Wink tells it, of the heralds of the gospel, you could say it's an illiberal political theology or political ideology.
Good, because they
This is why
aspire to be. Yeah.
this is why I was problematized by the fact when you actually look what they're doing, it just looks like a religious order that's
Mm.
ultra Catholic or ultra conservative. So if it just remains in that latter camp,
Yeah.
then it remains a part of the kaleidoscope of the liberal polity. If they actually tried to turn Brazil into this theocratic Catholic confessional state, then we're looking at something quite different. So it seems to me
Right.
there's a
But that's only going to happen in practice if they get enough numbers that they start having like a chance of political influence in the democratic sense, and then they can like hijack. Yeah, I see. But as it is currently implemented, as the ideology is implemented in practice, it is not post-liberal yet because it's just operating as a religion would. Yeah.
No, and as far as I can tell, it obeys the laws of Brazil. Like there's no suggestion that it's doing anything illegal or inappropriate, maybe weird, but it I assume it's got legal title to its property and everything's registered and probably in that sense integrated into whatever the Brazilian state is, which I don't know a lot about. And it this raises a question for me that I had and I wanted to ask you, because I think like the undertone of most scholarship on the far right is that the far right's a problem, right? Because it has these liberal tendencies, nativism, it's against egalitarianism, threat to the liberal constitutional order, etc., etc. But from the prism that you raised, which is a really good one, I mean, if these people just form their intentional communities, forget what the propaganda says, maybe they've got all kinds of extreme views. You could say this about conservative Muslims, but if they obey the law, they're kind of out of sight, out of mind, doing their own thing. Are they a threat, actually, to the liberal order?
No, and indeed, I think that liberals being hysterical about what a threat they are is actually anti-liberal because it's not letting people form their own conceptions of the good and act in accordance with them. Again, we should be worried about freedom of exit and we should be worried about indoctrination and coercion. And of course, like I can see that a feminist, might want to say something about women choosing to go into like highly gender hierarchical, sex hierarchical experiments and living situations, or being the cult follower and having sex, like they're all having sex with the
cult leader.
charismatic leader. Yeah, I can see how you would want to say like that's a bad choice, like, and here's why you might be making it. But I do think that's an expression of what liberalism permits, which is everyone to try to find meaning and purpose and a good life in whatever way seems right to them. So it's only at the point that it becomes a serious enough group in terms of numbers that if that group is not itself committed to liberalism and its place within it, then you get a problem on your hands. And I can see that maybe some like very precautionary type of thinker might be like, well, no, but you should never even let that get started because it's a slippery slope to them having the numbers. But I just don't think these ways of living are actually attractive enough to enough people. Like they often rely probably on people that have like, I don't know, like, you're in a period of your life where you don't have a strong enough sense of self that like being part of a cult is appealing or community is more important than anything else. But after 2 years, you're repaired enough to get out. And I just don't think they're ever going to really get the numbers that they could hijack liberalism in the democratic sense. But maybe I'm just being naive and this video will be the one that cancels us in the future.
In a way, these case studies or these groups are tests, aren't they, of whether you really, how open a pluralism and liberal order you're really in favor of, or whether you really have a qualified view of liberalism, which is you set the boundary around communities and expressions and ideas and practices that you're okay with. And they may be kind of, I often wonder whether if you're on the left, your tolerance goes further on the left spectrum than it does on the right, and vice versa.
For sure, yeah. And that tolerance issue too, I mean, it speaks to some of our earlier episodes. We talked about Moira Deeming's case and we talked about counter speech. like, I think because I had the strong sense in those discussions that, like, Melbourne could afford to be a lot more tolerant about
Mhm.
white supremacist ideology because we're such a secure, multicultural, progressive state.
Yeah.
And that really was the same sense I'm articulating here, that, like,
Mhm.
liberalism commits you to letting people do their stuff,
Yeah.
and you only work, like, you keep an eye on it, but you worry at
Yeah.
the point that it really does become a threat. You don't get hysterical about it when there's one guy on his weird speaker's corner soapbox saying hateful things.
Yeah.
And just having that sense of judgment, I think maybe it's missing a bit in some commentators, or
Yeah, definitely. Perspective. Holly, we're at 55 minutes. I think we should bring this to an end. It's our final episode for the year. Thank you very much for the very stimulating
it's been
conversations.
great.
To the viewers and listeners, if you've enjoyed this episode or any other and you haven't already, please follow the podcast,
I
subscribe
thought
to
you
the
were going to
YouTube
say
channel.
Happy Christmas to the viewers and listeners. Happy Christmas. Happy New
I
Year.
will. I should have actually
I
begun
would
with
have put,
that.
because then the
but
music's going to get loud over you and no
yeah,
one will hear what you're saying.
I know it looks like I'm very well rehearsed and prepared, but to let you into a little, peel back the curtain.
Things are not
Sometimes
what they appear.
it's just happening in the moment. So I will finish, Holly, my call to action, as
Blah, blah,
say.
follow us, something, something. Happy Christmas, goodbye.
All right, let's leave it there. Merry Christmas, everyone. You too, Holly.
Yeah, you
Catch
too.
you all next year.